Hello, and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast, where you can learn powerful techniques to change the way you feel. I am your host, Dr. Rhonda A, and joining me here in the Murrieta studio is Dr. David Burns. Dr. Burns is a pioneer in the development of cognitive behavioral therapy and the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 30 languages. His latest book, Feeling Great, contains powerful new techniques that make rapid recovery possible for many people struggling with depression and anxiety. Dr. Burns is currently an emeritus adjunct professor of clinical psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine.
Hello, Rhonda.
Hello, David, and welcome to all of our listeners around the world, around the galaxy. This is the Feeling Good podcast, and we're at episode 449. We had such great feedback for a different episode that we did with you, David. I think it was episode 440, where I asked you personal questions that we decided to do it again and ask you even more personal questions because it's really fun to get to know you. And you have such funny stories. Do you want to give our listeners a summary of what they're going to hear today?
Yeah, we about a year and a half ago, I did part one and what I thought would be a series of personal stories from the 60s. And we got through about half of them, and nobody requested the second half, so I figured people weren't interested. But a young man named Clyde emailed and said, when are we going to hear part two of those great stories? And that's today. And the 1960s, the late 60s, I was in medical school at Stanford. But it was the hippie days, the days of Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters, and the human being in Golden Gate Park and dropping acid, and all of these magical things were happening all the time. And so I'm going to try to bring a little bit more of that magic to life for you today. And of course the moral of the story, or the stories, because I'm going to tell you 9 short little stories, is that magic is possible for all of us on every day, including today. I think the magic comes from within you. But I've always thought the magic is in California, because whenever I've been in California, there have been many, many magical things happening.
Nice. Well, I thought I'd start off reading an endorsement regarding a previous podcast 446, which came out April 28th. And that was when we interviewed Rachel Sewell, the pediatric endocrinologist who is providing gender-affirming care to youth. And Marie wrote us, and she said, "Hi, David. I just finished listening to the latest episode of your podcast, Gender-Affirming Life-Saving Medical Care, featuring Stanford's Dr. Rachel Sewell. And I wanted to thank you, Rhonda and Rachel, for bringing such caring clarification to the painful experience of transgender and gender-diverse young people. I can imagine that Rachel's job will only get harder in light of the political environment, and I worry about the young Americans who will suffer for lack of proper care. It was, therefore, incredibly heartwarming to hear an endocrinologist who is in the first line of fire express so much care and knowledge. I was also touched by the respectful curiosity you and Rhonda brought to the show. My son is a transgender male who, even with a supportive and informed family living in a country that has made it fairly easy to get care and transition legally, has suffered from living in a body that did not match his identity. Thank you for having the courage to dedicate an episode to this subject. Warmly and with gratitude, Marie."
Well, thank you, Marie. We really appreciate your kind, warm email. And it really makes us connect with our podcast fans as a family and as humans talking to each other, and not some kind of show business production, which we ain't, but we sure appreciate the chance to hang out.
Yeah.
Should we dive right in?
Let's dive in.
Stories?
Yeah.
Well, the first one is from my psychodrama experiences, and to tell you what that is, and to give you just a very short background, I probably wasn't a good choice for medical school. I should have gone to psychology graduate school, because I wasn't a medical type, but and I cut an awful lot of classes because I just wasn't interested in histology and anatomy and pathology and all of these medical kinds of issues. But there was this crazy Chinaman named Husain Chung who created, well, that's how he described himself. I don't mean to be politically incorrect. I'm trying to be historically honest and respectful of Hussein and who he saw himself as.
Okay.
And he was a layperson, but he had started a thing in Palo Alto called the Human Institute. It was a big building off of El Camino. And he would have sometimes encounter groups there. But what he was really famous for was these 48-hour marathons. There would be about 30 people, and they'd rent a house for the weekend, and they were very wild affairs. Essentially, people went into the middle of the circle one by one and got really confronted and challenged. And I never fully understood it, but I know it was thrilling, and I learned an awful lot, and it was scary. I was scared a lot of the time. But the idea, I think, was to rip people's defenses away so their true self, their tears, the things they've been hiding inside would come out. And that was called crashing. And when they crashed, then people would take them and throw them in the air and catch them, and the lights, colored lights.
Literally throw them in the air?
Yeah, yeah. And we move them around with our hands.
Oh, wow.
And beautiful music would come on that was intended to reflect the person's subconscious mind or inner psyche or whatever conflict they were facing. And it was dramatic. And I think once we were on this 72-hour marathon, it was an experiment. And I remember there was a young man there who was from Los Angeles, and his father apparently was quite wealthy, and the young man was a delinquent, and the father was very worried about him getting involved, on the wrong side of the law and with the, gang activity, and made an arrangement with Husain Chung for him to stay at the Human Institute full time for a week or two to see if they could straighten him out. But I remember we were doing a marathon, and it was kind of frightening, and there was I was naive at the time and seeing a lot of things for the first time. And I remember some couple who were having some problem with a lot of hostility and anger and aggression in their marriage. But then Hussein made some reference to the fact that this young man would be kind of maybe come out next to do his thing. And when he said that, the boy bolted out of the house and started running at high speed. And in a marathon, you weren't even allowed to leave the premises. Wow.
Were people sleeping regularly?
Would sleep at night, maybe 4 hours, and sleep on the floor type of thing.
Wow.
I mean, they weren't real fancy. They only cost like $35 for the weekend.
The reason I ask that, because you're so much more vulnerable when you haven't slept regularly.
Part of it. Yeah. That's right. There's sleep deprivation, and you don't do an awful lot of eating. And so you become more vulnerable, and that actually improves the workshop, because then people crash more easily and do their thing. Wow. But at any rate, somehow it seemed to be my job. I was an intern for 6 weeks, so I was supposed to be helping out at these marathons, doing whatever I could to help out. And so I think I was supposed to go and run after this kid. And as I was leaving to chase after him, Husain Chung, who's kind of a guru type, he said, when a stallion runs, you run with the stallion.
Oh, wow.
And so I kind of got that message, and I ran out at real high speed to catch up with him. I used to do a fair amount of running in those days, actually. Mm-hmm. So I could catch up with him, but he was running on, I don't think I had shoes on this kind of pebbly, rocky surface. It was kind of painful.
Wow.
But when I caught up with him, And I think he intended me to grab him or something, to restrain him. And I didn't. I just ran with him. I said, I'm supposed to run with the stallion. And he suddenly caught on to the fact that I was just being with him and that I wasn't trying to put any limits on him. And that was one of Hussain Chung's things, too. And we do it somewhat in team, is paradoxically going with the patient rather than trying to control the patient or direct the patient. But it was kind of fun, and we got about a block away from the house and ran onto these people's lawn, and there was a hose there, so I turned it on full blast and just started, shooting water at this kid. And he realized it was just a fun thing, and then he got a hold of the hose and started squirting water back on me, and then we walked together back to the marathon. But it was just something always stuck in my mind, because it was how to work a little bit of a miracle with a kind of an oppositional, rebellious, hostile, angry teenager. You meet them where they are, so to speak, rather than trying to be an expert. So
that's neat.
I learned a lot from that I've actually used in my life a great deal, and I've used in therapy as well.
So you went with him instead of opposing him or trying to control him.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
And that's kind of what we do in team.
Yeah.
We go with the patient's resistance. So that's a beautiful way. Thank you for saying it. Yes. And it's a lesson you have to learn experientially. If you just hear the words, it's, words.
Right.
But when you experience it, it's kind of a beautiful, miraculous thing.
Nice. That's neat.
Yeah. I'm glad you made that connection. Help me understand it, Rhonda.
Oh, thank you.
Then the next one was a frightening encounter that I had at the Human Institute, and what I learned from it. And if any of you have struggled with anxiety, you might find this interesting. But it wasn't a psychodrama marathon, one of these 48-hour or 72-hour mega events. It was just like a Friday evening from maybe a 3-hour from 5 to 8 p.m. type of thing. And again, there were about 35 people in a circle. And one of the people I spotted on the other side of the circle was Vic Lovell. He was the person who Ken Kesey wrote the book One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and he dedicated it to Vic Lovell. And Vic Lovell was kind of an awesome clinical psychologist, and still is, and he was active in psychodrama. And he had a house in Palo Alto, a commune where 10 or 15 people lived, and he had little encounter groups at this place where they lived. And I had been there about a week earlier, and I got somehow confronted and challenged by him and his cronies, and I found it very much a humiliating, probably well-deserved humiliation, but a humiliating experience, and I was feeling kind of angry and kind of afraid of him, and there was a fellow who was my mentor at the Human Institute, Sergio Salvi. And he was a pretty tough guy. He had been a probation officer in Los Angeles, and he knew the ways of the world. I was a naive medical student and just trying to grow up and learn the ways of the world a little bit. And Sergio came up, we were waiting for the encounter group to start. And he said, "David, is everything okay? You're looking a little uncomfortable." And I said, "Sergio, I'm freaking out because I'm just as anxious as hell." And he said, "Well, kind of what are you anxious about?" And I said, "Well, I really got slammed by Vic Lovell at an encounter group at his house a week or two ago, and he's right over there on the other side of the circle." And I'm just looking at, I didn't realize he was going to be here. And I just got really panicky, and I don't know what to do. And then Sergio said, well, anxiety is often just another emotion in disguise. And it's actually, in your case, it's a form of anger that you're trying to control, that you're probably really pissed off at Vic Lovell. And you experience it as fear and anxiety, but underneath that, you're probably really, really mad at him. I said, well, yes, I think I am. I think that's going on. What should I do? And he said, well, as soon as Husain Chung says it's time to start, I want you to rush over to him, grab him by the shirt, by the neck, and drag him into the middle of the thing. And
what?
Him in the face.
What?
And I said, are you sure that's what I'm supposed to do? Because I've never done anything like that before. And he said, absolutely. And so
punch him in the face, David?
Yeah, like not with the fist, but whack him with slap him as hard as you can in the face.
Wow.
And I was just terrified. And Hussain Chung said, okay, let's start the encounter group. And so I just got up and rushed over at Vic Lovell, and he looked shocked and terrified. And I grabbed his shirt, right below the neck, and pulled him over into the middle of the group. And I said, I've got a bone to pick with you. And then I whacked him in the face as hard as I could.
Oh, my God.
And he seemed startled and he started wrestling, but I kept whacking him and kind of made a quick domination of it. And he looked really, really scared. So I kind of backed off. But that was my story. And but I'll never forget either how terrifying it was, but then how realizing what was really going on was quite of a different nature. Uh-huh. And we've turned that on in team with the hidden emotion technique, that often when you're anxious, and I've had a lot of videos I've posted on our Feeling Great channel on this topic, often when you're really struggling with anxiety, it's because you're an overly nice person, and under the surface there's other feelings that you're not expressing and not acknowledging, and finding out what those feelings are and finding a way to express them is another powerful technique for the treatment of anxiety that applies to most of our listeners, because most of our listeners struggle with anxiety and are terribly nice people. And you don't have to do something as dramatic as, whack someone in the face, but often sharing those feelings can be a tremendous healing effect. And I really learned something.
And what was your relationship with him, Vic, after that? How did he respond?
Well, actually, I didn't run into him because we were in different circles, but I ran into him about 30 years later when I came back to Stanford. I'd been in Philadelphia. I became a licensed physician and did my psychiatric residency, and we spent 20 years in Philadelphia, and then we came back finally to California. We always wanted to make it back to California. And it was almost like a miracle that we were able to get back and get a house. And I went to a grand rounds at Stanford because the general public can attend. Although I've been on the voluntary faculty at Stanford since 25 years ago, roughly. And I saw him and sat right down next to him, and we just picked up like old friends, and it was really cool.
That is cool.
And I mean, he was a neat guy too. He did all kinds of cool stuff. And as I say, Ken Kesey dedicated that One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest novel to him. It was a bestseller, and that was turned into a movie. And it was all about the excessive rigidity in psychiatry, which we were crusaders against that at the time.
Huh. Wow.
But anyway, that's that story.
That's a really interesting story. Definitely. I never expected that's what you were going to say.
Yeah, it was exciting. Sadly, there's two sides to everything. And I love Sergio, and he taught me many things, got me out of a lot of pickles, and because he always knew what to do, and he had the rule: don't ever let anyone get the better of you. And he lived that to the T. And then I found out that this is so sad that he was apparently living, in an apartment with his wife, and there were two women living next door, and they were playing really loud music, and he got irritated and told them to turn it off, and they refused, and that's a bad situation with someone like Sergio, and he went back and got a pistol and went into their house and murdered both of them. And then he took his own life. It was really, really sad.
Oh my gosh. That is, oh my gosh, what an ending to the story.
Yeah. Yeah. People have different sides to us. And I still love him. I still feel tenderly toward him. But we all have these, kind of flaws to ourselves. And as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten a little bit more accepting. I've had to be, because I have so many flaws myself. But,
wow.
And anyway, that's
an incredible story.
The full story.
Wow.
But to switch to another wavelength, one of the things that was going on in those 60s, I was trying to learn the ways of life, because I was raised in this ultra right-wing Christian upbringing, and I don't mean to be overly critical of it, but I thought I was pretty critical. And one thing, I never learned how to hang out with kids. I was the guy, I would always be class president in grammar school and middle school, but I never had any friends. People just admired me because I always got the best grades and things like that. But I didn't know how to hang out with people. In fact, I remember once in seventh grade, this really neat girl was sitting right behind me, and I think she was flirting a little bit. And she said, "What kind of popular music do you like?" And I said, "Oh, well, I don't know anything about the popular music really." And she said, "Well, don't you listen to the radio?" And I said, "No, I've never learned how to work a radio. It seems too complicated." And she said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, there's all these numbers like 90.5 on your radio dial, and then these letters like KLM San Diego or something. And I can't figure out the code that links the letters with the numbers." And she said, "Stupid, you don't have to do that. You just turn the knob on and then move the dial until you find some music you like." And I said, "Oh, is that all you have to do?" But I was so naive, I didn't even realize she was probably flirting a little bit.
Yeah.
And, maybe I could have gotten a date there.
Yeah. But I wonder, did your dad forbid you from listening to popular music because he was a minister?
No, but he was pretty uptight. He thought that women who wore lipstick on Sundays were going to go to hell.
Oh.
And that if you chewed gum on Sundays, you would go to hell.
Wow, that's all it took to go to hell?
Yeah, he was very judgmental that way. I mean, he was a very successful minister, and people loved him, and he did a good job. But there was a lot of this rigid stuff, and I remember being with him once, and I don't mean to be putting him down, because I'm sure, I mean, he did a lot of beautiful things for shut-ins and making rounds on people who were dying and who were desperate, and he used to take me, to visit these elderly people and show me what he did. And so he did a lot of beautiful things, but he had sides that that I didn't like. But at any rate, I was trying to outgrow all of that rigidness when I was uptight. And so I was hanging around with this guy. I guess I can mention his name now, Michael McCabe. And if you're listening to this, Michael, please call me, because I've been trying to get a hold of you for a good 20 years or more. And I don't know whatever happened to you, but he was a fellow. He was living with his mommy. He said he was a mommy's boy. And he rode around on a motor scooter, and he sold men's clotheswear at Bloomingdale's. And the thing about him was he was always looked ultra awesome, like, he was just groomed to the teeth. And
that makes sense, since he was working at Bloomingdale's.
Yeah, and so he learned all about clothes and stuff, and he just looked always like a human lollipop or something like that. Everything was totally integrated, and we were unlikely friends because our lifestyles were so different. I was an uptight Stanford Medical student, and he was just working part-time at Bloomingdale's, and all he did was go around getting laid all day long. And it was
Wait, how did you meet him again?
I can't remember. We just kind of ran into each other and started hanging out. And I was just delighted because I thought maybe, he can, I asked him, maybe you can teach me how do you, how do you hustle? And because I'm like Mr. Claude, a naive wimp or something. So he kind of took me under my wing, and he made me change the way I dressed and change my haircut. And he taught me a lot, but I was trying to figure out how to not be so uptight. And so I told myself that I would wait. I went on University Avenue in Palo Alto, and there was the Mid-Peninsula Free University coffee shop. That's where I eventually met my wife. That was where all the hippies went. But next to it, there was this bar on the corner. And like the Hells Angels and different people like that would hang out in there and, drink beer and whatever. So I thought, well, I'm going to go in there and wait by the door, the front door. And the next girl, excuse the word, that's the word we used in those days.
No worries.
People still use boyfriend, girlfriend. But the next girl that comes in, I'm just going to say something very flattering to her. No matter what. I'm just whatever it is, I'm going to blurt it in and stop being such an uptight asshole. And so I was waiting, and no one came in. And then I heard some motorcycles come up, and it was the Hells Angels. But I wasn't paying attention to that aspect. But then suddenly they came in, all covered with tattoos, and they had this babe, if I can use that term.
Yeah.
She was probably 18 years old, or 19 at best. And she was wearing a T-shirt, not a blouse, and had very protuberant boobs sticking out, and no bra.
Oh wow!
and so I wasn't thinking, and I said, that's a really cute blouse. And it wasn't even a blouse. And I said, what a stupid thing to say. And she looked at me and put her arms around me and started hugging me and wriggling her body up against mine and say, oh, you're so cute. Thank you. And then with her Hells Angels, and went up to the bar to do some drinking and whatever they did in there. But it was just
what was your reaction?
I couldn't believe it. I thought, I said, my God, Dave, you're lucky they didn't beat the hell out of you. But they didn't seem to mind it at all. They seemed to enjoy it. And it kind of taught me, it's okay to be crazy and say, oh, my name is David Burns. I'm a medical student. What's your name? Somehow that didn't get me any dates.
Yeah.
I found another way. There's a world of hustling, people who live for fun. And that's what a lot of what I was learning in the 1960s was how to change the way my role, the identity I was assuming, and changed my view of life. And it was just a fantastic period of my life. It was outrageously exciting and amazing. Every day was amazing. And I'll never forget that era. And the things I learned on the streets were the things that I was able to teach my patients. The things I learned in Stanford Medical School, I never learned one thing that ever helped one patient. But because, patients are like David. They want to learn, how do I get laid? If I'm a guy, and I would say, well, I can teach you that for sure. I have the best teacher in Palo Alto. And women, how do I get men chasing me? And I say, I'll show you. This is going to be an exciting adventure for you, and it's going to be fun for me to teach you. And people love that stuff.
So no, back to that bar.
Yeah.
So after she wiggled and hugged you and left and went up to the bar and hanging out with all the Hells Angels, did she come back to talk to you? Did you go back up to her, or was it just that was it?
Noticing there's a different kind of wavelength that certain people were on, and there were these uptight losers types who were sitting on the sidelines, and Michael taught me how to. There's another way to be. And then we did a lot of crazy things together. Should I give an X-rated story?
Oh, absolutely, definitely.
Oh yeah. Well, he used to do crazy stuff. We were once into sitting and having a pizza on a Friday night, and he was saying, "Well, let's make something happen." And he says, "I'm going to call someone I think you'd like," and he called this girl, and she appeared, and I think another one he called appeared, for him, and. The one for me was a young married woman, and she was dressed to the teeth, kind of like a model or something. And just gorgeous beyond imagination.
Okay.
and then she said, Michael told me that he's assigning me to you for the weekend. And the only thing, there's only one rule. She said, my husband's away for the weekend.
Oh my gosh.
And so at the end of the weekend, I'll be going back to my husband. So the only rule you have to follow is not get too attached to me.
Oh, okay.
We're just going to have fun all weekend.
Oh, wow.
And that's what happened.
Okay. Well, he sounded like a really good friend at that time for your life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was like magic. That's like the late 60s. This is just one variety of hundreds of varieties of magic that were happening all over every day.
That's funny.
Pretty cool. So I hope I'm not making a fool of myself. But
no, absolutely not.
I learned about a side of life that I didn't learn about in Sunday school. I'm sure you didn't learn that in Sunday school. Yeah. Another cool thing that happened. We used to hang out at the Stanford Student Union. There's a big quad behind there, and then the post office and the bookstore on the other side of the quad, and there was just it was just a fun place to be and have some coffee or something and just shoot the breeze. And I was leaving the Stanford Student Union, the outdoor area, and walking to some other area, and this bearded hippie fellow, walked up to me and kind of bumped into me.
Physically bumped into you?
Yeah, a little bit, and there weren't other people around, so it wasn't clear why we were bumping into each other. And he said, "Do you want to know what your problem is?" And I said, yes, I would love to know what is my problem. And this is such a weird interaction because I'd never seen him before in my life. I had no idea who he was. And he said, your problem is that you're always grabbing at the universe and chasing the universe. And it's impossible to be successful that way. you have to learn to sit with open hands, open your hands, and let the universe come to you.
Hmm.
And then he walked off in his direction. I never saw him again.
Wow.
But it was so true what he said, and again, it's formed an awful lot of my philosophy in so many areas, and dating and doing psychotherapy. We use that term, sitting with open hands, if a patient has resistance, and there was just a lot of wisdom in it. And he wasn't malignant. He didn't like bump into me in an aggressive way or something. But who knows?
Well, and you said you didn't know him, but he didn't know you at all. So he must have just picked up your energy, or was psychic in some way.
Yeah.
How
or
fun!
Maybe he'd seen me or whatever. But it was so true. And then another memory I have was the being inside the Stanford Student Union, having coffee or something, and Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters walked in, and he was like on the level of a god in those days, and his merry pranksters were a group of like beatniks from the earlier beatnik era and different, spaced out people, dropping LSD practically every day. And
what?
He was one
Every
of the ones
day?
that got LSD started. Yeah, he and Vic Lovell got it started, probably in the United States or in the world, because it was they got it from the let's see, it wasn't the FBI, but the the CIA. The CIA were doing experiments at the Palo Alto or the Menlo Park VA with LSD.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Because they thought it was going to be some kind of war type chemical that they could use. And so Vic Lovell and Ken Kesey volunteered to be in these experiments, and then they found out how awesome LSD was, and they got some way to start getting it from this group in the CIA and distributing it. And it was pure Sandoz LSD. It was like the most pure possible. But at any rate, Ken Kesey, he also wrote the book, or not the book, but the electric Kool-Aid acid test.
Right.
A book about he got a van and had it, psychedelically painted with stuff and drove it through the United States trying to get people to turn on. We were all kind of evangelistic because we saw how amazing and magical and beautiful life could be. But at any rate, he walked in with his merry pranksters, and they were dressed in like pajamas or clowns outfits. One of them was Neil Cassady, who was one of the original.
These are all people you knew?
Beatniks. What?
And you knew them?
Well, I mean, we didn't hang out all the time, but we would know each other from hanging out at Howard Barney's house or something like that. I mean, they were people you had interactions with. Ken Kesey, I had an office in a building next to the Mid-Peninsula Free University. It was an old rickety building, and you had to go up with this stairway to the second floor. And I rented a little pad there for $30 a month. It had been a closet, but it had a window in it, and I made it into a real cool little pad. I didn't have much money, but I put pillows on the floor and stuff like that. And Ken Kesey had his office about just right down the hall, so we were interacting with these people. But at any rate, he came in.
Wow.
And Neil Cassady was a speed freak. An intravenous amphetamine user, and he looked like a mechanic, and covered with tattoos and T-shirt and and he was juggling hammers while they were walking.
Wow!
And I remember that there was a hush in the room. It was as if you were in a Christian church and suddenly Jesus and his 12 disciples wandered in.
Oh my God!
People would be really, shocked and amazed. And it was like, oh my God, this is incredible. And they just wandered around in the student union and then went on their way. But in those days, people were not like trying to be, controlling things or whatever. And I'd heard that when he was on that thing that the book was about, the electric Kool-Aid acid test, that they had 8mm cameras and they were filming all along. And so I thought, gosh, I'd love to see that film. So I found his phone number and called him up and asked if he did have that film, if that was true. And he says, oh, yes. But and I said, well, what's on it? What does it show? He said, oh, it isn't very good because we were all stoned on LSD and they weren't very good cameras and we were jiggling them. And so the footage isn't very good. And I said, well, are you going to do anything with it? And he says, no, I don't think so. I said, well, could I have it? And he said, oh, yeah, I'd be glad to give it to you. And he gave me all that movie footage from that electric Kool-Aid acid test.
What? They did?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Where is it? Do you have it?
No, it was. I looked at it and showed it to some friends, and it wasn't very good. We didn't see how it could be usefully edited. And then I eventually just left it somewhere or gave it away to somebody else. It was kind of the tone in the air was not, we weren't like holding on to things, you might say. That like it was
right.
The flow type of thing. But let's see. I have a few
that's
more
amazing.
stories here. Do we have time for a couple more?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I was probably very obnoxious in those days, and in these days, I suspect a lot of the time too, and. But we were all searching for something, and that's why we were doing psychodrama and dropping LSD and going to BNs and doing crazy things because we were trying to understand, what life was like and what was possible. And one of the ideas from psychodrama and just in the air was that the whole secret of mental health or enlightenment is to express your feelings and to be genuine. And this idea is still promoted heavily in these days, and its assertiveness training and some forms of psychotherapy are based entirely on helping people express their feelings in a genuine way and becoming more vulnerable. And this was really held out as kind of a secret of the enlightened life. And so perhaps in my naive way, I took it seriously and decided to test it. If sharing your feelings openly was really a key to some magical way of experiencing life. And so I made a decision to share my feelings openly and immediately, no matter what they were and no matter what situation I was in. And I decided also to carry a tape recorder with me and a microphone so I could record what happened. And then I skipped another week of medical school and just wandered around expressing my feelings.
What happened when you went back to medical school after a week of skipping it? Did your teachers say anything to you? Like, where have you been?
No,
or
I don't think they knew who I was because they hadn't seen me very often.
Because you kept cutting.
I'll tell you,
classes.
That's another story. Remind me to tell that story. But when we would go back to when we went back to medical school, because a couple of us were doing this, we would go and first of all we went try to go back a week before final exams so we could find out what classes we were supposedly taking.
Okay.
And so we would go back to the quad and find out what classes we were supposed to be in. And then we would buy the textbooks for those classes and study like crazy for a week and try to pass the exams. And then go to the next semester or quarter or however it was set up and keep, tripping around again. That was kind of how it worked.
Okay.
And another time I'll tell another even wilder story. Maybe we told it last time about, when Gene Altman and I went back and went to one of our classes, and something really weird happened. But at any rate, with my tape recorder, I went all over Palo Alto, and then I went up to San Francisco, and I slept overnight in a $2 a night hotel or something real cheap. And wherever I went, I would just express my feelings. And to tell you the truth, nothing much happened. And finally, I ended up back at the Student Union on the last day of my experiment, and I saw some fellow sitting at a table in the Student Union, and I felt an sudden dislike for him. So I said,
just all of a sudden, you had a sudden impulsive dislike for this fellow,
like kind of anger or hatred or repulsion or something like that. And so I said, well, David, you got to follow your rules. So I walked over with my tape recorder and microphone and said, I just want to tell you that I don't like you. I don't like you one bit. In fact, I find you kind of repulsive.
You just went up to this strange guy and said, I don't like you. I find you repulsive.
I had to follow. I had to express every feeling because some guru said that's the thing to do. So I was trying to find out. And he looked up to me and he says, well, I'm not surprised. And I said, well, why aren't you surprised? And he says, well, you probably saw my picture on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle this morning.
What?
And I said, no, I didn't. I don't read newspapers. Why were you on the front page? And he said, I was arrested. I was trying to blow up a building on the Stanford campus, and they were onto me, and they arrested me. And
that's what this guy said?
Bail.
Oh, wow.
And I said, wow, I didn't know about any of that. And then I noticed he was wearing, I think it was like a beautiful Navajo ring. And I grew up in Arizona, so I knew what quality Navajo jewelry looked like. And it looked like something of real high quality. And so I said, I have to express my feelings. And so I said, I also want you to know that I think that ring you're wearing is awesome. It's just really, really beautiful. And he said, oh, here, you can have it. I'm not going to need it where I'm going to.
Hmm.
And he gave me that ring.
He gave you that ring?
Yeah.
Gosh, do you still have that ring?
No.
Because you weren't attached to things.
Yeah, we weren't thing collectors, but it was.
But you're psychic.
Yeah, well, we probably are all a little bit, and
you're picking up the energy
when our hunches were right, and we suppressed the stories when our hunches were wrong. So
yeah.
That guy's really sensitive, but I'm kind of insensitive, to be honest.
But you picked up that this guy was unlikable or something about him.
Yeah.
Or or dangerous.
Yeah, right.
Huh.
Like narcissistic and antisocial.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And, let's see. Well, maybe this isn't too interesting to people, but I remember, when you're supposed to take the Hippocratic Oath, my senior year of medical school, I really got, I was hardly ever at class because I got so anxious because you had to work up patients and present them to attendings.
Yeah. And
I didn't know how to do that. And my friend Gene Altman didn't either. And, whenever they say, today you're supposed to go to the VA and you're going to, do a history and physical on a patient, I would head in the opposite direction as fast as possible. And, but I remember once.
I could just I just have this image of a teacher saying, okay, head to the VA, David, you're going to work up a patient. And you go, and out the door.
Yeah, that's right. I had I'd often speed off in my motorcycle. But then anyway, I met Melanie, who I started living with, and we've been married for decades. And yesterday was her birthday, and we went out and celebrated, and we have so many memories to think back on. But I remember when we were both hippies, and she was about 8 years younger than me, and we were hitchhiking down the Foothill Expressway. We used to hitchhike all the time, and we ended up homeless, and we would just hitchhike to wherever we wanted to go. But I remember hitchhiking down, I think it's called Junipero Sierra when it goes past Stanford, and that's the part we were at. And then I saw the medical school graduation off in the distance, and it was my medical school class.
Oh my gosh!
Certificates, and we were just hippies, wanting to hitchhike somewhere and get stoned. And I'll never forget that. And I never picked up my graduation certificate until about 10 years later or something. I found out that they were filed somewhere, and I went to this office and said I'd like to get my medical school graduation certificate. And so I got it. It's really beautiful. It's on pigskin or something like that.
But David, what were you feeling when you saw your medical school colleagues graduating?
In sadness. I really kind of hardened myself to, the medical establishment, and I rebelled a lot. We had an encounter at the medical school that I sponsored called Psychiatry and Psychotherapy. Are they relevant or obsolete? And I invited Husain Chung to be the speaker and to present this idea. And I had little things printed up, piece of paper with the information, and I put one under the door of every person in the psychiatry department. Because we experienced the psychiatry department as being kind of rigid and into psychodynamics, and what we were doing in psychodrama is like, let's make people feel better today. People would get joy, every person who would come to one of those marathons, and it was fluid and powerful and engaging. And so we had this challenge, and they let me use one of the auditoriums, and the place was packed with people, but they were mainly people from Palo Alto and students, and not a single member of the Department of Psychiatry attended or dared to come to it and kind of face Husain Chung. But that was kind of the theme in those days, and one of the reason that I'm back now at Stanford, I've been on the voluntary faculty for at least 25 years, and I give up my time, at least 1,000 hours a year, sometimes more, teaching and helping people with research, because I'm so grateful that they put up with me. And allowed me to graduate, and probably had the belief that someday these oddballs might make their own contribution to medicine or psychiatry. Yeah. So that's actually what I've been trying to do. But my last story is a little bit about that. I dropped out of medical school for a full year on 2 different occasions because I didn't.
Wait, 2 different times?
Huh?
2 different times. So you were in medical school, then you dropped out, you took a whole year off, then you went back to medical school, you dropped off again and took a whole year back off, and then you went back to medical school.
Well, the last year off was after medical school.
Oh, so that was after you finished medical school, before your internship or your residency.
I didn't apply for internship or residency because I knew that no one would have me anyway, and I didn't want to be a doctor.
Oh.
And I just said, I'm going to live my life and explore the world and see what comes my way.
Oh.
And so that's when Melanie and I started living together, and we ended up down in Carmel Valley, and also what's that town next to Pebble Beach and Monterey? That's between the two of them. It's over on the Pacific Ocean. Next to Monterey and Pebble Beach. Pacific Grove.
Oh, Pacific Grove, okay.
Yeah. We were living around there, and Melanie was pregnant, and we didn't have a place to live. And we didn't have any money either. And so we would just hitchhike around and ask people if we could sleep on their floor. And I was at the time in this group called Subud, S-U-B-U-D, and it was another one of the kooky things going on. It was kind of an Indonesian cult. And but it was quite in vogue in those days, and you can read about it on the internet. And had this guru Bapak, B-A-P-A-K, who was the head of it, but anyway, I think it was kind of a Muslim or type group. But it was all about, receiving directly from God rather than, having to go through spiritual experts. And they would separate the men and the women once a week, and then you'd kind of scream and roll around on the floor for 30 minutes in the dark, when you were presumably receiving. And, nothing amazing ever happened to me. So I left the group because I thought it was kind of a sham. But once when we were in Carmel Valley, they had a Subud group there, and we were hanging out with them. And one night they say, we're going to do this Ramadan thing, and you can join us. I said, yeah, that'd be great. But what is Ramadan? How does it work? And I don't remember it exactly, but I remember we were sitting around a fire all night, and there was, you weren't allowed to eat during the daytime hours or during the nighttime hours. I wasn't sure what, but whatever it was, we were obeying the rules. And, I guess we were kind of praying or whatever you do when you sit around a fire at Ramadan. But I asked somebody, what is the purpose of this Ramadan? And they said, the purpose of Ramadan is like if you have physical needs, like for food or shelter or money or things like that, then you fast and do the Ramadan, and then it will come to you. So I thought, that's a good idea. So I did it. And then what I'd been doing was wandering around, and I mean, people are probably going to just think I'm real kooky or off when they hear this podcast. And if you think that, that's what I think too.
Yeah, you do kind of sound that way.
Yeah. But what I mean, all I ever wanted to do was counsel people. I didn't want to get a medical license first and do all of that. And when we were during that year off, I would counsel people. Anyone who wanted counseling, I would give them free counseling. And I used to wander around on the beaches and, see if there was somebody who had a problem, needed counseling, or go into coffee houses and get coffee and see if someone needed counseling. But it was real hard to make money that way.
Wait, what did you just say? What did you just say? You would go to coffee shops and see if anybody needed counseling?
Yeah, just talk to them and say, do you have any problems that you need any help with or something? That's something I like to help people out with.
How many people would respond yes?
Well, very few.
Okay.
But it was a kooky era, so occasionally people were. Okay.
In
the era in the late 1960s, it was a crazy and wonderful era, and people like Rhonda who make this a crazy and wonderful era.
Yeah.
But at any rate, after that Ramadan thing, I just had this idea, and I told Melanie, I said, if I gave in and did my internship and residency in psychiatry, I still wouldn't know anything, because I was convinced that psychiatrists were kind of frauds. They don't really know anything. And to this day, I believe that also. That science still hasn't taken over. Yeah. It's just still kind of psychodynamic cult and different cults, that type of thing. People don't like it when I say that, but I've always seen it that way. And so I said, what would you think, Melanie, if I called Stanford and maybe I can get someone on the phone and find out if there's any openings anywhere for an internship? And so I called up and got this guy on the phone. I I didn't know who he was. He might have been a psychiatric resident himself. But I said, you probably don't remember me, but I was a kind of an awful medical student, and I didn't go through the match. And if I had, I don't think anyone would have wanted me, because I don't even, never really even learned how to read an EKG or use a stethoscope or anything. But do you know if there's any place that has an opening, maybe, where I could apply? Because this was in July or August, or just before July. It was just a few weeks before, internships were beginning. And people, some were going to Seattle, which was very prestigious, and some were going to Denver, which was very prestigious. And people were proud and, to get their placement at a good.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I know it's really impactful.
Yeah. So he said, well, I'll tell you, he said, there's this Highland Hospital in Oakland, California. It's this huge county hospital with tons of psychiatric patients and tons of medical patients. And one of their internships the fellow who matched there, something happened. He had a family problem and he had to withdraw. So they have an open slot. And the head of their residency program is Harry Weinstein. Mm-hmm. And you could call him because they'd probably take any warm body.
Mm-hmm. So they'll take anyone there.
Yeah. So I called him and he says, yes, we definitely need someone. Why don't you come on up and, we can talk. And he accepted me into the residency program.
When you went up there and met him? Or just from that phone call?
Desperate. And I was a medical school graduate.
Yes, you were.
And then I told him, I said, well, the only thing is now I want you to know that I've cut an awful lot of my classes when I was a medical student, and I don't know how to use a stethoscope or read an electrocardiogram. I don't know how to read an X-ray,
And that was all true? You didn't know how to use a stethoscope?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, because there are these heart sounds you have to listen to and detect different kinds of cardiac problems, arrhythmias and problems with valves.
And you skipped that class.
Well, it wasn't a class. It was
no, I'm just teasing you.
Whole course, a lot of study and learning that you had to do.
Yeah.
And so I said that, and he says, well, I'll tell you what, if you'd like, you could start a month early your internship and work in our emergency room because they have 10,000 severe trauma and medically ill patients every month. And you go and talk to this fellow who's the head of the emergency room and see if they'd like to have an extra person for a month. So I went and talked to this guy. He was some kind of a kidney surgeon, but he was the head of the emergency services at Highland Hospital.
Oh.
And he says, well, David, we'd love to have you. I can give you a position where you're on 12 hours and then off 12 hours, 7 days a week for the month until your internship starts. And you can sleep in the residence quarters, so you'll be essentially working nonstop, and we'll make a doctor out of you in that month.
Wow!
And I said, "Wow, that is a fantastic thing." And then I did that, and I'll never stop loving Highland Hospital because they changed my life, and they made a doctor out of me in that month.
Yeah! Wow.
I started working the opposite from Stanford because I was so relaxed there because it wasn't real fancy like Stanford where you've got 20 doctors for every patient. Here you've got 20 patients for every doctor.
Sure.
And so you have to do it yourself and learn how it's done by doing it. And they were so kind to me and the staff and they were so skillful. And I thought these people, to me, are more high-powered than the people at Stanford because the people at Stanford, they're talking and having conferences all the time. But these people are actually treating patients 100% of the time.
Wow.
And the most severe patients in the world go through Highland Hospital.
That's for sure.
And then I just started, and then when I got into my normal residency, I just started the opposite from the way I'd been at Stanford. I started just studying like crazy.
Huh.
And the New England Journal of Medicine had this case conference every week that they would publish some impossibly difficult patient that had been referred to Harvard, to Massachusetts General Hospital, because no one had been able to figure out the diagnosis. Weird immunological disorders for the most part, but various things, just really hard things. And I started reading those and trying to see if I could guess what the answer was.
Oh, cool.
And I really studied them, and I really worked hard, and it was like just being immersed in medicine nonstop, and learning by doing rather than reading textbooks or something. And it was some of the best days of my life. And then,
and I bet the staff really appreciated you, and I bet the patients really appreciated you.
Yeah, because they were just people. They were prostitutes and people without much education or resources, or people living on the streets, and they were so grateful and so emotional and so warm and so kind. That's how I remember it. And then in the spring, there was the licensure exam, and some people took it after 2 or 3 years of medical residency, but you could take it, your first year. And I decided to take it my first year, and it was a 2-day examination. And I remember when I was a medical student, we had to take these exams too. And we used to pride ourselves on getting one of the lowest passing scores in the United States.
Oh my gosh.
What happened? Gene Altman and I. We were competing for the lowest score that could still pass. And I remember when I took that one at Highland Hospital, and I looked at the questions, they were, how would you treat this patient, and how are you going to read this X-ray? And I looked at it, and the people were just saying, oh, this is so hard on the breaks, and I don't think I'm going to be able to pass this. When I looked at it, I said, my God, this is ridiculously easy, because we'd been doing all that stuff and much harder.
Oh, wow.
And
much more complex.
I just whipped through it. I might have gotten all of them correct because I just understood everything. And I think I got one of the highest grades in the state of California. So it was kind of the opposite from
that's nice.
when I was a medical student. But that's how I happened to come into my career. And I spent 2 years there, and then went to the University of Pennsylvania and learned how to do research and publish papers and things like that. And then I learned cognitive therapy.
And that's another quality. I don't know if this is part of it, but if that's another quality of Team CBT, that you had to find the internal motivation to do the work.
Yeah.
And you found it at Highland Hospital.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thank you.
But anyway, that's the
well, this was really fun. It's really fun getting to know the young David.
Yeah.
Yeah. The young, crazy kind of kooky David.
Yeah. It was just, there were so many loving people and just hanging out.
Nice.
So
great.
Thank you for letting me tell these stories, Rhonda, and thank you all for listening. Really, really appreciate it. And I hope something touched you or made you laugh or kind of had a little fun with. But
yeah,
it was they were those late 60s in California was one of the greatest times of my life. I learned so much.
Yeah, for sure. It sounds really fun, and lots of challenging times too. I mean, it sounds like you really grew up.
In many ways, yeah. I had to give up this idea of what I thought was right and wrong, and who I was, and how things worked, and it was discovery. And I learned so much from Michael McCabe, because what he knew, so some people hated him, but I saw him as a kind of genius in his own right. And what he really knew was how to have fun.
Yeah, how to live life.
And that's what we did. We hung out together for a good 2 months, every day, all day long, just going around having fun. And we were just making it up as we went along. Like we weren't getting dates or having parties. It was just, life was one big party. So if we wanted to party, we would find some young lady with a van, a Volkswagen van, and say, do you want to party? We can find some people and we'll go and party.
Cool.
And then she'd say, oh yeah, let's do that. And then we'd drive around Stanford and find people on bicycles and say, we're going to go up the hills and party. Do you want to come with us? And everyone wanted to come with us. And it was just, it was seeing how life can be, because we get so rigid sometimes.
Yeah. Well, and it's a really different time in the world now. I think if you pulled somebody over and said, hey, we're going to have a party in the hills, a lot of women especially would run the opposite direction.
That's what Michael said in the 1960s.
Really?
That exact thing.
Oh, said, really?
Yeah. If you told this to people, this is what they would say. But that's not the way what they really do.
Cool. Interesting.
But I think he manifested having fun, not something that, women used to say, I wouldn't touch that guy with a 10-foot pole. All he cares about is sex. And that was true. And then he would walk right up and put his arm around that exact woman and whisk her off, and they would do their thing. And we all have
without complaining
idea about how we are.
Yeah.
And then we have this real idea. We're really still children. We want to have fun.
Yeah. Nice.
We want to explore and, but
cool.
Anyway, there's
okay. Well, thank you so much, David. And it was really fun doing this podcast with you. I appreciate you.
Thanks.
This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes under the podcast page. You will also find archives of previous episodes and many resources for therapists and non-therapists. We welcome your comments and questions. If you want to support the show, please share the podcast with people who might benefit from it. You could also go to iTunes and leave a 5-star rating. I am your host, Rhonda Borowski, the director of the Feeling Great Therapy Center. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.